The morning Abraham Barker chose to stay was the same morning the herd crossed the Red River without him, and not a single soul on that drive could have predicted that a man as restless as the Texas wind would plant his boots in one place and refuse to move. It was the spring of 1874, and the Chisholm Trail was running fat with cattle and lean with patience. The drive had started 3 weeks earlier out of San Antonio, pushing some 2,000 longhorns north toward the Kansas stockyards at Abilene, where the railroads waited like hungry mouths, and the money flowed the way the rivers never did in drought years. Abraham Barker had ridden point on cattle drives since he was 18 years old, and he was 32 now, which meant he had spent 14 years of his life eating trail dust and sleeping under stars that were beautiful and cold and utterly indifferent to a man's comfort. He was good at this work. He was very good at it. His hands knew the rhythm of the rope before his mind caught up, and his horse, a broad-chested roan named Copper, read the herd the way some men read scripture, with devotion and instinct and a kind of reverence. But the morning they reached the small spread just south of the Red River crossing, something stopped Abraham Barker dead in his tracks in a way that no stampede, no flooded crossing, and no armed rustler ever had. He had ridden ahead of the herd by nearly a mile, scouting the terrain the way trail bosses expected of their point riders, checking the ground for soft spots that could swallow a steer, and the banks for drop-offs that could send the whole enterprise sideways. The morning was clear and golden, the kind of morning that made men forget the hard days, and the smell of the spring grass was sweet enough to make your eyes sting. He came over a low rise and saw the homestead below him, a modest house of rough-cut timber, a barn that had seen better seasons, a garden that was fighting bravely against the rocky soil, and a woman. She was on the roof of the barn. Abraham pulled Copper to a stop and stared. The woman had a hammer in her hand and a line of nails between her lips, and she was working a board across what was clearly a gap in the roof, with the focused, determined effort of someone who had decided that the roof was going to be fixed today regardless of what the universe had to say about it. She wore a plain cotton dress the color of creek water, faded to something between green and gray, and her dark hair was pinned up in a loose arrangement that the morning breeze was systematically dismantling. She was not small. She was not fragile. She moved with the confidence of a woman who had been solving problems alone for long enough that she had stopped wondering whether she could do a thing and simply started doing it. Abraham watched her for a moment that stretched longer than he intended. Then a board shifted under her foot and she caught herself, one hand gripping the ridgeline of the barn with a knuckle-whitening grip while her boots scrambled for purchase on the weathered shingles, and before he had made any conscious decision whatsoever, he had sent Copper down the slope at a canter. "Ma'am," he called out as he drew near, pulling up short of the barn. "You need a hand with that." She looked down at him with dark eyes that were completely composed despite the fact that she had just nearly slid off a barn roof. The nails were still between her lips. She removed them with one hand, holding them in a neat line between her fingers, and regarded him with an expression that was not unfriendly but was absolutely not the expression of a woman who needed rescuing. "I have been on this roof for 2 hours," she said. "I expect I can manage the remaining 20 minutes. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "but that south board there is rotten. You step on that and you will be on the ground." She looked at the board he indicated and some small acknowledgement passed across her face. "Then I will not step on it," she said. "Ma'am, with respect, it is not always easy to tell the rotten ones from up top. The rot comes from underneath." A pause. She looked at him with the measuring look of a woman who had learned to assess everything carefully, because she could not afford to make many mistakes. "There is a ladder on the north side," she said finally, "if you feel compelled." He swung down from Copper and tied him to the fence post and went around the north side and climbed. By the time he reached the ridge, she had identified 2 more boards that wanted replacing, and they worked in a silence that was somehow entirely comfortable, the hammer passing between them as needed, the roan shifting contentedly below. The sun climbed and the work went quickly, and when they came down from the roof, she wiped her hands on her apron and told him there was coffee if he wanted it, with the tone of a woman who was offering coffee, not issuing an invitation to anything more complicated than coffee. Her name was Myrtle Fairchild. She told him so at the kitchen table, pouring from a heavy pot with the practiced efficiency of a woman who ran her household, the way a good trail boss ran a herd, with order and economy and no wasted motion. She was 29 years old. Her husband, a man named Charles Fairchild, had died 14 months ago of a fever that had come on fast and left faster, taking him with it in the space of 8 days. She had a daughter named Clara who was 7, and who was currently at the one-room schoolhouse 4 miles east. She had 40 acres, a small cattle herd of her own, some 12 animals, a kitchen garden, and a barn that, as of this morning, had a sound roof. She told him all of this not in the manner of a woman unburdening herself, but in the manner of a woman who understood that information was currency, and that the basic facts of her situation were simply the landscape of her life. She asked him where he was headed, and he told her about the drive, about Abilene and the stockyards, and she nodded with the nod of someone who understood the economics of cattle as well as anyone. "You had better get back to your herd," she said when the coffee was done. "You have a crossing to manage." He knew she was right. He thanked her and went out and untied Copper and rode back toward the drive. And all the way back he was thinking about the way she had looked at him from the barn roof, with those composed dark eyes, and the way she had said, "I expect I can manage," without a single note of defensiveness, just as a statement of plain fact. He thought about her for 3 days before he made his decision. In the evenings around the fire, he found himself quieter than usual, which the other hands noticed the way men always notice a change in someone who has been predictable. Hector Salinas, who rode drag and had known Abraham for 6 years, finally asked him flat out what was eating at him, and Abraham told him, not everything but enough, about the woman on the barn roof in the small spread south of the Red River, and Hector listened and then was quiet for a while and then said, "That is either the best idea you have ever had or the worst, and I am not sure which." Abraham was not sure either. He lay on his bedroll and looked at the stars and thought about what his life actually was when he examined it plainly. He had money saved, not a fortune but enough. He had no land. He had no house. He had a roan horse and a good saddle and the kind of skills that were useful everywhere and rooted him nowhere. He had not been in love, not really, not the kind that made a man understand what he was willing to give up. He had been close to it once with a woman in Fort Worth, but close was not the thing itself, and he had ridden away from that one without much looking back, which told him something about whether it had been the real article. What he felt thinking about Myrtle Fairchild was different. It was not comfortable or easy. It was the feeling you got when you looked at something that mattered, something that you recognized on a level below the rational, below the calculated, somewhere in the old animal part of you that knew what was worth fighting for. He went back on the morning of the 4th day. He told trail boss Conrad Webb that he was leaving the drive. Conrad was a grizzled, leather-faced man of 50 who had seen many things in his career and was not easily surprised, but this surprised him. He stood in his stirrups and looked at Abraham with an expression of genuine bewilderment and then said, "You are walking away from your wages and your bonus for a woman you met for 1 hour on a roof." "I helped her fix a barn roof," Abraham said. "I drank her coffee, and yes, I am." Conrad looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Well, men have done stupider things," and reached across and shook his hand, and Abraham turned Copper south. He did not know what he was going to say when he got there. He was not a man given to long speeches. He had spent too many years where the land was the main speaker, and men were merely its audience to have developed the habit of elaborate expression. But he knew that he was going back, and he knew why, and he thought that if he was honest with himself and with her, the rest would either work or it would not. The homestead looked different in the afternoon light than it had in the morning. The shadows ran the other direction, and the kitchen garden showed the neat rows of her effort, beans and squash, and a stand of corn that was fighting to get tall, and the barn roof showed the new boards bright against the old weathered ones like a patch on a good coat. It was a good place. Small and hard and real. Myrtle Fairchild came out of the house when she heard the horse, and she stood on the porch and looked at him with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but something more careful than surprise. She folded her arms across her chest, not in a defensive way, but in the way of a woman thinking something through. "Your herd has crossed the river by now," she said. "Yes, ma'am, it has." "You missed the crossing." "I did." She looked at him steadily. "What is it you want, Mr. Barker?" He got down from Copper and held the reins and looked up at her. "I am not entirely sure how to explain it," he said, which was the most honest thing he could offer. "I rode with that herd for 3 days after I left here, and I could not stop thinking about this place. About you. I know that is strange. I know I have no claim on anything here. I know you did not ask for company, and I know you are managing just fine without it. I can see that plain as anything." He paused. "But I was wondering if you might let me be useful to you for a while. I am a fair hand with most things, cattle and fence and carpentry. I am not given to trouble. I will sleep in the barn and I will work for no wages, just room and board. And if at the end of it you want me gone, I will go without argument." Myrtle Fairchild was quiet for a long time. A mockingbird was carrying on in the mesquite tree at the corner of the fence, running through its whole catalogue of borrowed songs, and the wind moved through the grass in the slow way it did in the afternoons. She looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than was entirely comfortable. "Mr. Barker," she said at last, "I appreciate what you are offering, but I want to be plain with you. I am not looking for a husband. I am not looking for a protector. I lost a good man 14 months ago, and I am still finding my feet. What I need is straightforward work done, and what I do not need is a man who thinks he is rescuing me, because I am not a woman who needs rescuing." "I do not think you need rescuing," Abraham said. "I watched you nearly fall off a barn roof and keep your composure. I am not a fool." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was not nothing. "The south pasture fence needs mending," she said. "6 posts are rotted at the ground. My cattle are eating the Dawson family's grass, and old Mr. Dawson has the disposition of a feral cat about it." "I can start on that tomorrow," Abraham said. "There is a cot in the tack room," she said. "Clean your boots before you come into the kitchen." "Yes, ma'am." And Mr. Barker, he had started to turn toward the barn, and he turned back. "I am not a charity. Whatever you fix right. I do not want patchwork." "No, ma'am," he said. "I never learned how." She went back inside, and he led Copper to the barn, and that was how it began. The first week was all work, which suited both of them. Abraham replaced the 6 fence posts in the south pasture and found 4 more that were wanting attention and replaced those too, digging the old ones out of the dry ground with a methodical patience that was simply part of who he was. He checked the condition of her cattle and found 2 steers with pink eye, which he treated with the tincture from his saddlebag, because he carried it as a matter of habit, and this impressed her more than she let on. He split a season's worth of firewood and stacked it properly against the north wall of the house where it would stay dry, and he repaired the gate hinges on the corral, and he rebuilt the step on the back porch that had been giving under weight for what looked like a considerable time. Myrtle watched all of this with a careful eye, but she did not hover, and she did not check his work in a way that was insulting. She simply noticed, as a woman who was responsible for everything around her had learned to notice. At meals she was practical and generous. The food was good, plain and solid, and there was always enough of it. At breakfast she would say what she planned to do that day, and he would say what he planned to do, and they would nod at each other and go do it. Clara came home from school the first afternoon and looked at Abraham with the completely unfiltered assessment of a 7-year-old. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's, evidently, lighter complexion, and she had the fearless directness that some children have before the world teaches them caution. "Are you going to live here?" she asked. "For a while," he said. "Can you make a whistle out of grass?" He could, as it turned out, and he did. And from that moment Clara regarded him with a warmth that was entirely uncomplicated, and that he found, unexpectedly, moved him deeply. Clara was a presence in the house that he had not anticipated in his calculations about this place, which had been more instinctive than calculated to begin with. She was at the age where she was making sense of the world in fast, eager bursts, and she asked questions the way rain fell in the spring, in quantity and without warning. She asked him why steers had horns, and why the grass was different colors in different places, and why stars did not fall, and what Abilene was like, and whether he had ever seen a buffalo. And he answered all of these questions as honestly as he could, which meant that sometimes he said he did not know, and she seemed to appreciate that as much as any other answer. Myrtle watched these exchanges with something she would not have named, not yet, maybe not for a long time. At the end of the second week, there was a difficulty with one of the steers, a large brindle animal that had gotten herself tangled in a piece of old wire out in the far corner of the east pasture. Myrtle found her in the morning and came back for Abraham, and they went out together and worked on it side by side for an hour, the steer panicking and pulling against herself the way frightened animals do, which makes things worse, and it took patience and steadiness, and the right kind of quiet authority to settle her enough to get the wire loose without causing more damage. Abraham held the steer's head and spoke to her in the low, even murmur he used with frightened cattle, and Myrtle worked the wire with her bare hands, which were quick and sure. And when the steer finally pulled free and stood trembling and then shook herself and walked away as though the whole thing had been a mild inconvenience, they both sat back in the grass and looked at each other and simultaneously started to laugh. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. It was genuine and unguarded and completely unlike the careful, composed person she was the rest of the time, and it did something to Abraham's chest that he took note of without examination, the way you take note of something important without being quite ready to deal with it. "She will be fine," Myrtle said, catching her breath. "She will," he agreed. "Cattle are tougher than they look." "So are most things," she said, and stood up and brushed the grass off her dress, and they walked back. It was on the third week that the matter with Tom Hadley occurred, and this was the first occasion when the world beyond the homestead pressed itself into their lives in an uncomfortable way. Tom Hadley was a man who ran a larger spread about 8 miles west, and he had been, according to a conversation Abraham eventually had with the storekeeper in the nearby town of Millhaven, something of a thorn in Myrtle's side since Charles Fairchild's death. Not in any way that was dramatic or violent. Hadley was not that kind of man, exactly. He was the kind of man who saw an opportunity in a widow's situation and pursued it with a persistence that he dressed up as neighborliness, but that was, underneath, acquisitive. He wanted the 40 acres. He had made offers, through intermediaries and once directly, that Myrtle had declined with a firmness that had not diminished his conviction that eventually she would have to sell. Hadley arrived on a Tuesday morning in a buckboard with a man named Peters, who was his foreman, and who had the look of a man who did whatever he was told without much internal debate. Myrtle was in the kitchen garden, and Abraham was working on the roof of the linta behind the barn. He saw the buckboard come up, and he watched from where he was, not intruding but present. Hadley was a big man, going to fat now in his early 40s, with the air of someone who had been successful long enough that he had started to mistake his preferences for universal facts. He tipped his hat at Myrtle with a courtesy that was technically courteous and substantively condescending, and he talked about the spring and the cattle prices and the difficulty of running a spread alone, all of which was preamble. Myrtle pulled a weed while he talked and did not look at him until he was done with the preamble, and then she looked at him directly and said, "Mr. Hadley, if you have come to make another offer on this land, my answer has not changed since January." Hadley looked around the yard in the way of a man making a show of assessing things, and his eye landed on Abraham, who had not climbed down from the linta roof but was sitting on the peak of it, listening without appearing to listen. "You have hired on a hand," Hadley said, with a note that might have been surprise and might have been calculation. "I have," Myrtle said. Hadley studied Abraham for a moment, and Abraham looked back at him with the flat, quiet look of a man who has nothing to prove and no interest in the proceedings beyond what directly concerned him, which this did. Hadley turned back to Myrtle. "You know my offer is a fair one, Mrs. Fairchild. This land is going to be harder to work every year without." "Without what, Mr. Hadley?" she said, and her voice was so perfectly level that the implied sharpness of it was all the more effective. Hadley shifted on the buckboard seat. "Without sufficient resources," he said. "I have sufficient resources," she said. "Good morning to you." Hadley nodded, not quite satisfied, not quite willing to push further with an audience, and drove away. Abraham climbed down from the lean-to roof and came around to where she was still in the garden. And she was working again, pulling weeds with a focused attention that told him she was using the work to settle herself. "He will not give up," she said, not looking up. "No," Abraham said. "Men like that generally do not. He made his first offer 3 months after Charles died," she said. "He sat in my kitchen with his hat in his hands and talked about how difficult things must be and what a responsible thing it would be to think of Clara's security, and I showed him to the door." "Good," Abraham said. She did look up then. "I do not need you to approve of my decisions, Mr. Barker." "No, you do not," he said. "But I can think something was right without it being approval, more like agreement." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back down at the garden. "There is a loose board on the north side of the lean-to, near the bottom." "I saw it," he said. "I will get to it this afternoon." This was the rhythm of them in those early weeks. The work and the plain talk and the careful distance, and underneath all of it, something that was growing the way spring things grow, quietly and with a kind of inevitability that the watching eye could almost miss. He started to learn her in the small ways that sustained contact allows. He learned that she was a better reader than almost anyone he had ever met, that she had books on a shelf in the front room that were worn with genuine use, Scott and Dickens, and a battered copy of Thoreau that she had marked in pencil throughout, and that in the evenings after Clara was in bed, she would sit with one of them and read by lamplight with a concentration that was total. He learned that she was funny, dryly and unexpectedly funny, in a way she did not advertise, and that when she was amused she had a habit of pressing her lips together briefly before she let the expression through, as though she were giving herself a moment to decide whether to allow it. He learned that she could whistle, genuinely whistle, a clear and tuneful sound, and that she did it unconsciously while she worked in the garden, and that she was embarrassed when she caught herself doing it in company. He learned that she grieved her husband in a way that was quiet and interior, and that she had not finished the grieving. Not finished it badly or wrongly, but simply not finished it, the way you cannot finish some things until you are actually ready and not a moment before. He did not push at this. He recognized it for what it was, and he gave it the space it deserved, because that was the only decent thing. He told her things too, in the evenings on the porch when the heat had gone down, and the dark came up around the house like a tide. He told her about growing up in East Tennessee, about his father who had farmed a hillside that was more rock than soil, with a stubbornness that Abraham had inherited in other forms. He told her about coming west at 18 with $2 and an idea, which was the same idea that had brought half the young men of his generation west. That space meant possibility, and that he had found that to be true in the way that complicated things are true, which is both more and less than you expected. He told her about the cattle drives without romanticizing them, which she appreciated because she had no patience for men who romanticized difficult things. He described the crossing of the Cimarron in flood season once, with 1,000 frightened steers and a river that wanted everything, and he told it straight, with the fear in it and the cold water and the cattle lost and the one saved, and she listened with the quality of attention she gave to her books. "Did you like it?" she asked. "The driving?" He thought about it genuinely before he answered. "I liked the competence of it," he said. "The way it required everything you had, I liked the country. I liked some of the men. But I never liked the transience of it. You are always arriving somewhere that is not your destination. You are always one place on the way to another place. She was quiet for a moment. And yet you left it, she said. I did. For a barn roof and bad coffee, she said, and the dry humor was there in the corner of her voice. Your coffee is not bad, he said. It is exceptionally strong, which is a different thing. She actually laughed at that properly, and the night air and the mockingbird were the only audience, and he thought that if he could make her laugh like that at regular intervals, he would consider his life well spent. There came a day in early summer, maybe 6 weeks after he had arrived, when Myrtle Fairchild was not all right, and she would not have called it that or admitted it in those terms, but Abraham could see it. He saw it in the morning when she came to breakfast, and the composure that was the surface of her day was thinner than usual, worn through in places. Clara was at school. Abraham poured his own coffee and sat down and said nothing, because he understood that sometimes a person needs to be in the company of someone who is not demanding anything of them, not even comfort, just presence. She sat down across from him eventually and wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at the table. It would have been our 10th anniversary, she said. I'm sorry, he said. We had plans, she said, for this place. Charles had plans. He was going to expand the herd and put in a proper well and build a room onto the north side of the house for when she stopped. We had plans. He said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. He did not try to make it better. He did not offer perspective. He just sat there with his coffee in the morning light and let her have the grief as honestly as it came. And after a while she straightened slightly and breathed out slowly and looked at him with eyes that were bright but steady. He was a good man, she said. He was not a perfect man. He was stubborn and he underestimated things and he trusted the wrong people sometimes. But he loved this land and he loved Clara and he loved me, and I miss him every single day. He sounds like someone worth missing, Abraham said. She looked at him for a moment and then nodded, and something between them shifted in that moment. Some small wall that had been there became something more like a door, not open yet, but recognizably a door. I should do the milking, she said. I already did it, he said. She looked at him. You did not have to do that. I was up early, he said. It wanted doing. She opened her mouth and then closed it again, and he thought she was going to say something about not needing him to manage things for her, and instead she said, "Thank you, Abraham." And it was the first time she had used his given name, and they were both aware of it, and neither of them made anything of it directly, but he felt it settle into him like warmth. The summer deepened and the work deepened with it, and Abraham proved himself in the way that honest work always proves itself, not through declaration, but through the steady accumulation of things done well. He took the cattle to the water and back. He repaired the wagon wheel that had been cracked and unserviceable for months. He negotiated, diplomatically and firmly, with old Mr. Dawson about the property line, and came back with a neighborly agreement that solved the pasture question without rancor. He rode into Millhaven once a week for supplies and the mail, and he did it without being asked, once she established that the pattern suited them both. Millhaven was a small town of perhaps 200 souls, with the standard composition of such places in that era: a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a church, a doctor who was also the dentist and whose success rate in both capacities was about equal, and a scattered collection of wooden buildings that aspired to permanence. The people of Millhaven knew Myrtle Fairchild and knew her situation, and they had various opinions about Abraham's presence on the Fairchild spread that they expressed with the unguarded frankness of small-town people. Some of these opinions were generous, and some were suspicious, and some were the particular kind of prurient that small towns specialize in, and Abraham ignored all of them with an equanimity that itself became a subject of local observation. He met Myrtle's friend Nora Hatch at the general store in his 3rd week in Millhaven, and Nora, who was a solid woman in her mid-30s with a direct gaze and an opinion about everything, looked him over with the thoroughness of someone who cared very much about Myrtle Fairchild and was going to make her own determination regardless of what anyone said. "She has not had it easy," Nora said, which was not exactly a warning but was not a warning. "I can see that," Abraham said. "She will not tell you when she is struggling," Nora said. "She would rather fall off a barn roof than ask for help." "I know," he said. Nora looked at him for another long moment and then appeared to make a decision. "She likes plums," she said. "If you ever find good ones, she would not ask you to bring them." "I will keep that in mind," he said. He found plums at the store in Millhaven 2 weeks later and brought them back, and set them on the kitchen table without comment, and watched Myrtle stop when she saw them and stand very still for a moment, and then look at him with an expression that was so open and unguarded that it was almost startling from her. And then she said, "Where did you find plums in June?" And he told her about the store having a shipment, and she made a small sound of pleasure and picked one up and ate it standing right there. And the juice ran and she laughed at herself. And it was the smallest possible thing, and he thought about it for days. It was in July that they had their first real argument, if argument was the right word, which was not the worst kind of argument, not the cold or cruel kind, but the kind that comes from two people who are both strong and both used to making their own decisions, encountering the limits of their separate ideas about how a thing should be done. The issue was the cattle herd. Abraham had ridden out to check the animals that morning, and found that 2 of the older cows were showing signs that told him the herd needed culling, that keeping unprofitable animals through the winter cost feed and time, and reduced the overall health of the operation. He brought this back to Myrtle in the straightforward way he brought everything back, expecting a practical conversation, and instead hit the particular solidity of a person for whom the cattle were not just an economic unit. "Those 2 cows have been on this land since we started here," she said. "They have had a good run," he said, "but they will cost more this winter than they will ever return." "Charles bought the older one at a sale in Laredo," she said. "She was half price because she had a bad leg and he thought he could fix it, and he did. He understood then what he was dealing with and he adjusted. 'All right,' he said, 'they can winter, but in the spring we talk about it again.' 'In the spring we will see,' she said, which was not agreement but was not refusal. He dropped it. He dropped it not because he thought she was right about the economics, which she was not, but because he understood that the cows were not actually about the cows, and that some things matter for reasons that cannot be put on a ledger, and that a man who cannot understand that has a very limited understanding of what life actually is. She came out to the barn that evening while he was finishing with copper, and she stood in the doorway and watched him brush the horse in the low golden light, and she said, "I know you are right about the economics of it." "Maybe," he said. "No, you are," she said. She paused. "This whole place is full of him. Every post and every animal and every board. And sometimes I'm not sure whether holding on to all of it is something I am doing for good reasons, or just because letting any of it go feels like losing him again." He set the brush down and looked at her. "Probably some of both," he said, "and neither one of those is wrong." She leaned against the door frame and looked at him with that measuring look that he had come to know, and that no longer felt like scrutiny the way it had in the beginning. "How do you always know the right thing to say?" "I do not," he said honestly. "I just try not to say the wrong thing, which is a different kind of skill." She almost smiled. "Go on and finish with your horse," she said. "Supper is nearly ready." August brought heat that was serious and unrelenting, the kind that made the air above the fields shimmer and drove the cattle to whatever shade they could find and made even the mockingbird quiet in the midday hours. Abraham worked in the early mornings and the evenings and rested at midday the way everyone sensible did, and in those rest hours he often found Myrtle on the porch with her book, and he would sit on the steps with his hat over his face and sometimes doze, and sometimes listen to the sound of her turning pages, and it was a quieter, more settled happiness than he had ever known in his life, and he recognized it as such. Clara had become his devoted shadow in the hours she was home from school. She was at the age of intense and rapidly shifting enthusiasms, and each new enthusiasm was presented to Abraham as though he were specifically required for its development. She decided she was going to learn to rope, and he spent 2 Saturday afternoons teaching her the basics, starting with a fence post as target, and she had good hands and the right kind of patience for it when she wanted something enough. She decided she was going to keep a journal and asked him what the most interesting thing he had ever seen in his travels was, and he told her about seeing a river in flood from a high bluff. The way the brown water moved with a power that was completely indifferent to everything human, and she wrote this down with great seriousness. She also decided, with the unself-conscious clarity of children, that Abraham was good and that she was glad he was there, and she said this to him one afternoon as directly as she said everything, sitting on the corral fence while he worked on the gate mechanism. "I am glad I am here too," he told her with equal directness. "Mama seems better," Clara said, with the matter-of-fact perceptiveness that children have about their parents. He was quiet for a moment, working the gate latch. "Your mama is a very strong person," he said. "She cried sometimes at night," Clara said, not as a revelation but as information. "Not now, though, not for a while." He did not respond to this except to nod, but it stayed with him in the way that important things stay. In the last week of August, Myrtle went to visit Nora Hatch in town and left Abraham with Clara for the afternoon, and Clara directed their time together with the authority of someone who had given this considerable thought, involving a series of tasks that included identifying cloud shapes, practicing roping on the fence post, and attempting to teach Abraham to do something with a piece of string that Clara called a string game, which Abraham failed at comprehensively, and which made Clara laugh until she had to sit down. When Myrtle came back at dusk, she found them on the porch steps, Clara leaning against Abraham's arm in the drowsy way of a tired child, and Abraham reading aloud to her from one of the books off Myrtle's shelf. He looked up, and she was standing at the gate to the yard looking at them, and whatever she was feeling in that moment was complex enough that she did not immediately speak, and in the fading light he could not quite read her expression, but he saw her press her fingers briefly to her lips. "Supper," she said when she had composed herself, and that was all. But something had changed. Something was changing, slow and steady and true, the way the deepest changes happen. September came in cooler, and with the cooling the pace of everything settled into a different rhythm, the urgent heat-driven effort of summer giving way to the longer, more deliberate work of fall preparation. Abraham helped Myrtle put up preserves, which was not work he had done before, and which she taught him with a patience that surprised him, given that patience was not usually her dominant note when teaching someone something. He turned out to be competent at it, which also surprised her, and she said so. "Did you expect me to be incompetent?" he asked. "I expected you to be impatient," she said. "I am patient with things that require patience," he said. She said, which was her sound for concession without full admission. He had learned to like that sound. One evening in mid-September, after Clara was in bed and the evening had gone cool and the stars were out in the way they got out in the Texas dark, thick and extravagant, he was sitting on the porch steps and she came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one and sat in the chair rather than going back inside, and they sat together in the quiet with the night around them, and after a while she said, "Nora asked me what is happening between us." He kept his eyes on the stars. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I was not sure," he nodded slowly. "What are you sure of?" She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass in the dark. "I am sure that this is the most settled I have felt in a long time," she said. "I am sure that I trust you, which does not come easy to me anymore. I am sure that Clara loves you, which matters to me more than I can adequately express." Another pause, and "I am sure that I am frightened." He turned to look at her then. "Of what?" "Of how much this matters already," she said. "I did not want to need anyone. After Charles, I told myself I would not need anyone again, because needing someone means they can be taken, and I do not think I could." She stopped and looked at her hands around the coffee cup. I do not think I could survive losing someone again the way I lost him. Myrtle, he said, and her name in his voice was something she heard differently than she usually did, something careful and warm and specific. I cannot promise that nothing bad will ever happen. That is not a promise any honest person can make. But I can tell you that I came back here on purpose, knowing what I was giving up and knowing what I was choosing, and I have not for one single day regretted it. I can tell you that I intend to be here, not because I have nowhere else to go, because here is where I want to be, this land, this house, you and Clara. She looked at him for a long time in the dark. That is a very large thing to say, she said. Yes, he agreed, it is. And you mean all of it, every word. She set her coffee cup on the porch railing and looked out at the stars, and he let her look, let her have whatever she needed to think through, because that was who she was, and you did not rush Myrtle Fairchild, and he had learned that early and kept on knowing it. I do not know what I feel, she said, quietly and honestly. I know that when you are not here I notice your absence. I know that I look forward to evenings on this porch in a way I have not looked forward to anything since. She did not finish the sentence. I know that when you laugh I think it is one of the best sounds I have heard. He smiled, not pushing, not taking it further than she had put it. That is enough, he said. That is more than enough for right now. She looked at him, and something in her face was softer than he had seen it, genuinely soft, underneath all the composure and the competence and the careful management of a life built around self-reliance. You are a very patient man, Abraham Barker, she said. I am patient with things that matter, he said. She almost smiled, recognizing her own words back, and picked up her coffee cup and looked at the stars, and they sat together in the dark for a long time without speaking, and it was one of the finest evenings of his life. October came and brought with it a problem that needed solving in a more immediate way than fence posts and barn roofs. Tom Hadley had not given up. The situation became clear on an afternoon when Abraham came back from a ride in the north pasture to find a man named Cole Whitmore sitting in a buckboard at the edge of the yard, presenting what he called a legal inquiry from Tom Hadley's attorney, which was a document suggesting that Charles Fairchild had, before his death, entered into a verbal agreement with Hadley regarding the possible sale of the eastern 20 acres, and that this agreement, while informal, represented an obligation that passed to his estate. Myrtle was standing on the porch reading the document with an expression of such controlled fury that it was almost more alarming than open anger, and when Abraham came up she handed it to him without a word. He read it. It was the kind of document designed to be ambiguous enough to frighten someone into settling. He had seen similar maneuvers in various forms in his travels. He handed it back. This is not enforceable, he said. A verbal agreement with no witnesses and no documentation is nothing. I know that, Myrtle said, still with that controlled fury. But fighting it will cost money and time, and Hadley knows that. Who is the county judge? Abraham asked. Horatio Fenwick, she said. He is a fair man. He has no love for Hadley. Then you write a formal response denying the existence of any such agreement, and you send it to Fenwick and to Hadley's attorney, Abraham said, and you make it clear that you have documentation of the condition of this property and this homestead, and that you are prepared to defend it in any proceeding they care to initiate. She looked at him. Can you write such a letter? I can draft it, he said. You should read it and change what needs changing, because it is your land and your name. They wrote it together that evening at the kitchen table, with Clara asleep and the lamp burning, 2 drafts and then a final version that was firm and clear and utterly without heat, while being entirely without submission, which was the right tone exactly. Myrtle signed it with a hand that did not waver at all, and Abraham rode to town with it the next morning. Cole Whitmore never came back. Hadley's attorney sent a brief letter 3 weeks later that was, essentially, a retreat dressed up as a clarification, and that was the end of that particular effort. He will try something else eventually, Myrtle said when the attorney's letter arrived. Probably, Abraham said. And we will handle that too. She looked at the word "we" for a moment, sitting in the space between them, and she did not correct it. November arrived, and with it came the kind of weather that reminded everyone in this part of Texas that the land did not care about human plans or human comfort. A blue norther blew in from the Panhandle on a Thursday, dropping the temperature 30 degrees in the space of an afternoon, and Abraham and Myrtle spent 2 days getting the cattle to shelter, and the root vegetables in before the hard frost, and banking the house against the wind. They worked in heavy coats and scarves, their breath visible in the cold air. And at the end of the second day, they came into the kitchen and Myrtle made the strong coffee that Abraham had teased her about, and they sat at the table with their hands wrapped around the cups and the warmth of the stove pushing the cold back from the room. And the contrast between the brutal weather outside and the warmth and light of the kitchen was so complete that it was almost a kind of luxury. "I never minded cold weather," Abraham said, "when there was something warm to come back to." She looked at him across the table. "No," she said. "On the drives," he said, "the cold was just cold. Just something to endure. There was no destination at the end of the day that was any particular comfort." She was quiet, looking at her coffee. "I used to hate winters here," she said. "The first 2 after we came here. Before the house was fully right, it was cold inside too, and everything felt hard and far from anywhere. But then we got the stove right and put in the windows on the south wall, and it changed." She paused. "I love this house," she said, simply and directly, as though it were important to say it plainly. "I love this particular piece of ground. I know it is not much by most measures, but it is mine. It is ours, Clara's and mine, and I have fought for it and I will not give it up." "You should not," he said, "and you will not." She looked at him across the table, and the lamplight was warm and the house was warm, and outside the norther was still driving, and she said, "Why are you so certain?" "Because you are Myrtle Fairchild," he said simply, as though that were explanation enough, and apparently it was, because she looked at him with an expression that was not quite any of the things it was adjacent to. Not quite gratitude and not quite affection and not quite longing, but something that held all of those in it like a river holds all the streams that feed it. "Abraham," she said. "Yes, I am glad you came back," she said. "After the barn roof, I am glad you turned around." He held her gaze. "So am I." They sat with that for a moment in the warmth while the wind made its complaints against the walls of the house that were strong enough to take them. "It is getting late," she said eventually. "Yes," he said. Neither of them moved immediately. Then she stood and began clearing the cups, and he stood and banked the stove for the night. And these small domestic rituals had the feel, by now, of something deeply established, something that had been happening for years rather than months. And he thought that was perhaps the most remarkable thing about her and about this place, that it felt like somewhere he had always been heading, even when he had not known it. December was a month of approaching resolution, though neither of them would have used that word. Clara began practicing for the school Christmas pageant with an intensity of focus that she brought to all her enthusiasms, and the house filled up with the sound of her practicing songs in the evenings. And Abraham listened and sometimes hummed along, which made Clara determined to teach him the words. And he learned them, which made Myrtle, listening from the kitchen, press her hand briefly to her mouth in that gesture she had when something got past her defenses. He had begun to understand her gestures in the way you understand a place you have lived long enough. The hand to the mouth meant moved past defense. The brief lip press meant suppressed amusement. The way she tilted her head slightly left meant she was about to say something she had been thinking through carefully. The straightening of her back meant she was preparing to handle something hard. He read her the way he read the land and the weather, with attention and respect, and not with the intention of using what he knew, but simply because she was interesting to him in all her details, interesting in the way that complex and beautiful things are interesting, not fully comprehensible and therefore endlessly worth understanding. There was an evening in mid-December when Clara had gone to bed, and Myrtle had set down her book and was looking at the fire in the stove through its small glass window, and Abraham was across the room with a length of leather, working a new cinch for Copper's saddle. And the silence between them was the entirely comfortable silence of people who have stopped needing to fill space with words. And Myrtle said, without preamble or introduction, "I have been thinking about what you said on the porch in September." He looked up from the leather. "I have said various things on porches," he said. "About being here on purpose," she said. "About choosing." He set the leather down. "Yes." She looked at him. The firelight was doing something to the planes of her face that was almost too good to look at directly, so he looked directly. "I have been thinking about what I am choosing," she said. He waited. "I have spent 14 months being very purposeful about my independence," she said, "because it felt like the only thing that was mine that could not be taken, and I have been very good at it. I am genuinely not someone who needs rescuing." She looked at him steadily. "But I have been thinking that there is a difference between needing someone and wanting someone, between needing to be rescued and choosing company. I wonder if I have been so determined to establish the first thing that I have been afraid to acknowledge the second." He was very still, listening to her with the same attention he gave to everything that mattered. "I want you here," she said. "That is the plain fact of it, not because I cannot manage without you, but because managing without you is not the only option and it is not the one I want." She paused. "Is that clear enough?" "Myrtle," he said, and his voice was something she felt as much as heard. "It is the clearest thing anyone has ever said to me." He crossed the room and sat in the chair next to hers, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, and she looked at him from that short distance with eyes that were clear and direct and absolutely present. And he reached out and took her hand, which was strong and warm and work-roughened and the finest thing he had ever held, and she looked down at their joined hands and then back up at him. "I am not promising to be easy," she said. "I am not asking for easy," he said. "I am asking for real." She leaned forward then, a small and deliberate movement, and kissed him, gently and with a care that matched the gravity of everything it meant. And when she sat back she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before, warm and certain and something like the end of a long trip home. "Real," she said. "Yes, that I can do." Christmas at the Fairchild homestead that year was the best Christmas Abraham Barker had ever spent, and he was aware of this while it was happening, which was unusual for him, because he had not generally been a man who noted happiness in real time. But sitting at the table that Myrtle had set with the good cloth and the china that had come across from her mother's house in Georgia, with Clara in her best dress conducting a breathless report of everything that was wonderful about the day, with the smell of the roasted chicken and the pies that had been baked yesterday, and Myrtle across the table looking at him with that warm, certain look she had worn more frequently since the evening in December when she had made her declaration. Abraham was aware that this was the specific kind of happiness that made all the years of getting here worth it. After Christmas and into the new year of 1875, things between Abraham and Myrtle moved with a quiet steadiness that suited them both. They were not people given to grand gestures. Their courtship, if it could be called that, had been conducted in barn roofs and fence posts and cups of strong coffee and long evenings on the porch, and its continuation had the same character. He began to tell her things he had not told anyone. She told him things she had kept interior for the entire duration of her marriage and her widowhood. These exchanges were not confessional in their tone, but simply the natural deepening of two people who had decided to know each other. He learned that she had wanted to be a teacher before she married Charles and moved to Texas, that she had some education for it, and that she had made her peace with the way life had instead given her this land and this work, but that she still felt the pull of books and ideas in a way that the ranch life did not fully satisfy. He told her about the feeling he sometimes had of moving through the world slightly untethered, the strange freedom and the loneliness of it that had been with him so long he had stopped recognizing it as loneliness until he came here and it stopped. He proposed to her on a February morning, standing in the kitchen garden with the cold air around them and the winter birds in the mesquite tree, and it was not elaborate. He said, "Myrtle, I would like to marry you if you are willing, not to take care of you because you are more than capable of that, but because I would like to do this life alongside you, and I cannot think of any other arrangement that makes sense to me now." She looked at him for a long moment, her breath visible in the cold air. "Yes," she said, "that makes sense to me too." He took her hands in his and she looked up at him, and he thought that of all the landscapes he had ridden through in 14 years of the trail, this was the one he wanted to look at for the rest of his life. They were married in March of 1875 in the small church in Millhaven, with Nora Hatch as witness and Clara as the most serious and proud member of any wedding party that church had likely ever seen. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Alcott, who was a good-natured man with a tendency toward lengthy sermons who, on this occasion, was persuaded by Myrtle's particular look to keep it brief. The whole of Millhaven that wished them well turned out, which was most of it, and there was a gathering afterward at Nora's house that was warm and good, and ran later than planned, because people were genuinely happy for Myrtle Fairchild and genuinely curious about Abraham Barker. And the two of them together seemed so obvious and right that even people who had been suspicious of Abraham's arrival 9 months ago were prepared to acknowledge that some things work out as they should. Tom Hadley sent no congratulations, but he also sent no more legal inquiries, and the following year he sold his own spread and moved to San Antonio, and the eastern 20 acres that he had coveted remained part of the Fairchild land, which was now the Barker land, or more precisely the Barker-Fairchild land, because Myrtle kept her name attached to it and Abraham thought that was perfectly right. The spring after the wedding, Abraham put in a proper well on the north side of the house, the one Charles had planned and not gotten to, and Myrtle stood by and watched the progress of it with an expression that was complicated and grateful, and a little sad in the way that the completion of a dead man's plans can be, and he understood that without being told and respected it without comment. When the well was done and the first bucket came up cold and clear, she put her hand on Abraham's arm briefly and did not speak, and he knew everything she meant. He expanded the cattle herd that summer, buying carefully at the sale in Millhaven, selecting animals with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 14 years reading livestock, and within 2 seasons the herd had grown from 12 to 30, which was enough to provide a genuinely solid income and enough to put a little back against bad years, which in this country always came eventually. He and Myrtle ran the operation as a genuine partnership, not divided by traditional roles, but by the practical logic of what each of them was best at, which meant that Myrtle handled the accounts and negotiations because she was sharper at these than anyone Abraham had ever met, and Abraham handled the physical management of the herd and the land with the competence that 14 years of hard work had built into him. Clara thrived in the way that children thrive when the ground under them is stable and warm. She was doing well at school. Her teacher, a young woman named Miss Aldridge, who had come west from Ohio with ambitions about education and a genuine talent for it, told Myrtle that Clara was one of the keenest students she had ever taught, and that she had an aptitude for figures that was exceptional. Clara remained Abraham's devoted companion in the hours outside school, still directing their time together with the benevolent authority of someone who had clearly decided he was hers, and this delighted him in a way he had not known it would. He adopted Clara formally in the summer of 1876, with a trip to the county seat and a brief legal proceeding that was more emotional for all 3 of them than any of them had quite expected, and Clara, who was 9 now and had her mother's gift for composure, cried on the way home in the wagon and did not apologize for it, and Abraham had to look very hard at the road ahead for a while because his vision was less reliable than usual. "Does this mean I can call you Papa?" Clara asked when she had recovered herself. "If you want to," he said. "I have been wanting to for a while," she said, with the directness that had been there from the first grass whistle. "I just was not sure if it was the right time." "It is the right time," he said. She leaned against his arm on the wagon seat and looked at the countryside going past, and Myrtle on his other side reached over and put her hand on his knee briefly, and he covered it with his. In 1877, Myrtle told him on a November morning that they were expecting a child, and she told him with the particular expression she wore when delivering information that carried enormous weight, but that she was determined to receive with steadiness. He got up from the table and went around and took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment and then kissed her forehead and pulled her to him carefully, the way you hold something irreplaceable. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I am also frightened." "I know," he said. "I was frightened with Clara too," she said. "And it was all right." "It will be all right this time too," he said, with not a guarantee but a steadiness that she leaned into. The pregnancy was healthy, and the winter and spring passed with the careful but not fearful attention of people who understood what was precious. Nora Hatch was a frequent visitor and a source of practical assistance. Abraham was attentive without being overbearing, which was the correct calibration and the one she needed. He did more of the heavy work without comment, redistributed the labor without discussion, because she would have objected to being managed, but she would not object to simple logic. The baby was born in the last week of June 1878, on a warm morning with the summer beginning to make itself properly known, and it was a boy. He was large and healthy and loud, with a pair of lungs that Abraham declared were the most impressive he had encountered, and Clara, who was 11 and had been waiting with enormous patience for this day, was allowed to hold him and did so with a gravity that was entirely characteristic. They named him Charles for the man who had planted this land and loved this woman, and Abraham for the man who had come back when he did not have to, and the boy's name was Charles Abraham Barker, and both names fit him. Clara grew into herself with the confidence of someone who was deeply loved and genuinely known. At 16, she was helping with the ranch accounts alongside her mother, and was outpacing Miss Aldridge in mathematics to the degree that Miss Aldridge had suggested she should eventually consider attending one of the women's colleges that were beginning to exist in the East, an idea that Clara received with the intensity of someone who had been waiting for permission to want an enormous thing. Abraham and Myrtle talked about this at length and with seriousness, and the conclusion they reached was that if Clara wanted it and the means could be found, she would have it, and they began putting aside what they could toward that end. Young Charlie grew in the way that healthy boys in the country grow, fast and noisy and physical, deeply interested in horses and cattle, and anything that moved. He followed Abraham around the ranch from the time he could follow, and Abraham taught him the way he had taught Clara to rope, with patience and humor and the firm expectation that things learned should be learned properly. By the time Charlie was 4, he could name every animal on the property and had opinions about most of them, particularly the large brindle cow that was the daughter of the original one with the bad leg, and who had inherited, apparently, both the bad leg and the survival instinct that went with it. In the spring of 1880, Myrtle told Abraham she was expecting again, and this time she told him at breakfast with a lightness she had not had the first time, the fear not gone but diminished by experience and by the quality of what they had built together. This baby came in October and was a girl, dark-haired and fierce from the first moment, and they named her Josephine, and Charlie, who was 2.5, regarded her with a wary interest that was perfectly reasonable, and that over the following months converted, slowly and without fanfare, into a devotion that was one of the sweeter things Abraham had ever observed. The homestead by now was genuinely comfortable and solidly established. The house had been extended with the room on the north side that Charles had planned, and then a further room beyond that for the children, and the barn was sound on every side, and the cattle herd was productive, and the well was good, and the garden was the best Myrtle had ever managed, because she had figured out in the years of working it what the soil wanted and how to give it that. The land was green in the seasons when land in this part of Texas could be green and brown in the seasons when it could not, and it was theirs, completely and beyond contest. There was an evening in the summer of 1881, a Saturday, when the heat was just barely beginning to consider relenting, and the whole family was on the porch in the late afternoon gold of it. Clara reading one of the books she had sent away for, Charlie making industrious use of some sticks and rocks in a construction project of evident importance, little Josephine asleep in Myrtle's lap, and Abraham in the chair beside Myrtle, his hand on the arm of her chair close enough to hers that their fingers were touching, looking out at the land that the light was making beautiful. "I have been thinking about something," Myrtle said. "What is that?" he said. "I have been thinking about the day I came out of the house and you were riding back," she said. "The second time, when you had gone back and then come back again." "I remember," he said. "I thought I knew exactly what I needed," she said. "I had a very precise inventory of it. The fence and the cattle and the house and Clara and the independence and the dignity of managing my own affairs." "You were not wrong about any of it," he said. "No," she said, "but I was not entirely right either. I thought I knew the shape of my life, and I thought I did not have room in it for anything more, because more would mean risk, and I had already given everything I had to grief once, and I was not willing to do it again." She looked at him. "And then this impractical man came down a hill to help me fix a roof I was managing perfectly well." "Impractical," he said with humor. "You quit a cattle drive," she said, "for a woman you spoke to for 2 hours." "1 hour on the roof and 1 cup of coffee," he agreed. "I am not sure it was practical." "No," she said, "but it was right." She looked at him with those eyes that still, after 7 years of marriage and all the life that had passed in that time, had the quality of seeing him precisely. "You were the thing I did not know I needed. I had accounted for everything and left you out because I did not know you existed." He looked at her for a long moment in the golden light, with the sleeping child in her lap and the busy boy at their feet, and Clara turning her page and the cattle visible in the near pasture, and the land stretching out beyond them in the warm late afternoon of a good life. "And now," he said. She turned her hand on the arm of the chair so that her fingers laced through his. "And now," she said, "I cannot account for a world without you in it, which is either terrifying or wonderful, and I have decided it is wonderful." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, briefly, and with the particular gentleness that he reserved for things he wanted to be careful with, which in his life was now a very specific and precious list. "Myrtle Fairchild," he said, and he used her name the way he had always used it, with the full weight of who she was in it. "Myrtle Barker," she corrected mildly. "Myrtle Fairchild Barker," he said, "all of it." She smiled, genuinely and completely, the smile she had learned to let through without pressing her lips against it first, and the evening came down golden around them, and Charlie showed them his construction project, which was, he explained with great authority, a corral for the small rocks, which were cattle, and Josephine woke and blinked at the world with the considering expression she had brought with her from the beginning. And Clara looked up from her book and said something dry and funny about the architecture of the rock corral that made all of them laugh, and the sound of it carried out over the land that was theirs, that had been fought for and worked for and loved into something worth keeping. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Abraham and Myrtle sat on the porch in the dark the way they had sat on hundreds of porches on hundreds of nights, and the stars over Texas were doing their extravagant best, and the land was dark and peaceful around them, and the cattle were settled, and the house behind them held everything that mattered. "Do you ever think about Abilene?" she said. "Sometimes," he said. "I think about the drive passing on. I think about Hector Salinas, wherever he is now. I think about Copper crossing that river without me. Do you regret any of it?" He turned to look at her in the dark, her face lit by the small light that came through the window, composed and real and entirely herself. "Not one day," he said. "Not 1 hour." She leaned back in her chair and looked up at the stars. "Good," she said, "because I would hate to think that the best decision of your life was made out of any kind of desperation. "It was made out of recognition," he said. "I saw something real and I recognized it." "What did you see?" she asked, not coyly but genuinely, with the directness that was the signature of everything about her. He thought about it, genuinely, the way he thought about things that deserved honest consideration. He thought about the woman on the barn roof with the nails between her lips and the composed dark eyes, and the voice that said, "I expect I can manage," without one note of performance in it. He thought about the coffee and the kitchen table, and the way she had talked about her land and her daughter with the clean, undecorated love of someone who knew what mattered and had organized their entire life around it. "I saw someone who had built something real in the middle of difficult country," he said, "and was tending it with everything she had. I saw someone who was not pretending anything was easier than it was or harder than it was. I saw someone I wanted to know." He paused. "And I saw someone I thought I could love." She was quiet for a moment. "Could," she said. "Do," he said. "Do love completely, without qualification." She turned her head to look at him, and he looked back at her across the small space of the porch, and the night held them both in it, warm and complete, and she reached across and took his hand the way she had on many nights and many porches, and every time it was the same thing and a new thing simultaneously. "I love you, Abraham Barker," she said. "I love you, Myrtle," he said. "I expect I always will." She smiled, the complete smile, the one she let fully through. "I expect you will," she said. "I expect we both will." The stars did their indifferent and beautiful thing overhead, and the land lay quiet in theirs, and in the house behind them their children slept in the deep safety of a home that had been built by love and work, and the particular courage of two people who had each, in their own way, been willing to choose something real over something safe. And the night was warm and long and good, and they sat in it together for a long time before they went inside. The following years brought the ordinary miracles of a life well lived. Seasons that were hard and seasons that were generous, calves born in cold mornings and saved by warmth and effort, the kitchen garden improving every year as Myrtle refined her knowledge of what the land wanted, Clara's departure for a women's college in Tennessee, tearful and proud, on a train from San Antonio in the fall of 1884, and the letters she sent back that were so dense with ideas and observations that Abraham sometimes read them twice and Myrtle 3 times before they discussed them. Charlie growing into a young man who had his mother's steadiness and his adopted father's feel for cattle and his own particular gift for making people trust him, which was a gift Abraham recognized and respected enormously. Josephine, fierce and dark-eyed, who turned out to have a gift for drawing that no one in either branch of her family could account for, who covered every available surface with sketches of animals and people and the land around them, so that the house became, over years, a kind of gallery of their life. And in the evenings always, Myrtle and Abraham on the porch, or at the kitchen table, or by the fire when winter came, talking or reading or sitting in the comfortable silence of people who had been through enough together to know that silence was not empty, but full of everything they were to each other. He was 40 when Clara left for college and Myrtle was 37, and they were not the same people who had met over a barn roof in 1874, and they were exactly those people. And the distance between those two facts was the whole story of what a good life does to you if you are willing to let it. On an afternoon in the spring of 1886, Myrtle was in the kitchen garden and Abraham came out of the barn and stood at the fence watching her, the way he had on 100 other afternoons, and she felt his attention the way she always felt it, warm and steady and specifically hers, and she looked up. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." She straightened and put her hands on her hips, the gesture he had loved for 12 years. "Abraham Barker," she said, with that mild exasperation that was entirely fond, "you have been looking at me for 12 years. "Yes," he said, "and you still find it worth your time." "More every year," he said, "considerably more." She looked at him with the composed dark eyes that had measured him from the top of a barn roof once, when he had been a stranger on a horse who thought she might need help, and she had been a woman who did not need rescuing and knew it and would be the last one to ask. "Come and help me with this section," she said. "The soil wants turning." He came through the gate and picked up the second fork that was always leaned against the post for exactly this purpose. Because after 12 years, the tools had arranged themselves according to the logic of two people working a life together, and he worked beside her in the warm spring afternoon on the land that was theirs. And the mockingbird in the mesquite tree was going through its whole catalog of songs the way it always did, borrowing every voice it knew and making something new of all of them. And the sky above the Texas hill country was that particular blue that appeared in the springs here and nowhere else on earth, and the cattle were visible in the near pasture, healthy and content, and somewhere in the house Josephine was singing to herself while she drew, and Charlie would be back from the north pasture by supper, and there would be a letter from Clara in a day or two because one was due, and the life of this place was all around them, complete and ongoing and warm with everything they had built into it. Abraham Barker had quit the Chisholm Trail on a spring morning in 1874 for a woman who did not know she needed someone to stay. He had come back down a hill on a roan horse to help with a barn roof that a perfectly capable woman was managing entirely on her own, and in doing so had found the one thing that all those miles and all those drives and all those years of moving had not been able to provide. Not rescue, not heroism, not even, in the end, necessity. Just the plain and irreplaceable fact of being where you belonged, beside someone who was exactly who you had been looking for without knowing you were looking. And Myrtle Fairchild, who had been certain she had everything she needed, and had been right about every item on her list except the most important one, had looked down from a barn roof at a stranger on a horse, and had not known yet that the most honest thing she would ever do was learn to say, "I want you here," and mean it without apology, without the armor of independence, without anything between the saying and the truth of it. She had not needed rescuing. She had needed exactly this: someone who saw that and stayed anyway, not because she was helpless but because she was extraordinary, and because the land and the life and the woman tending them were worth more than any cattle drive, any destination, any wages at the end of any trail in Kansas. The garden turned in the warm afternoon. The mockingbird sang. The house held its children and its books and its long history of a love that had been built slowly and honestly, and without any of the shortcuts that make things easy and nothing last. The roan horse, long gone now, had been replaced by others, and the barn had been repaired so many times it was essentially a different barn, and the years had done to both of them what years do, which is make people more themselves. And the spring came every year to this particular piece of Texas ground and found them here, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.